everybody. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's Moosnick lecture, the first of this year's Monroe Moosnick lecture series in Judaic Studies. I know this is a busy time for many, and I am grateful to see so many familiar and new faces in the audience. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carol Barnsley, and I am Associate Professor and Program Director of the Religion Program here at Transylvania University. I would like to begin with some thanks. There are a great many people I need to thank, and I'm sure I'll be remiss and forget someone. Forgive me. To begin, the Moosnick Committee, including Reverend Dr. Loida Mattel, Rabbi David Wirtschafter, Rabbi Shani Abramovitz, Dr. Beth Goldstein, and Dr. Rosie Moosnick. A note on our committee. I would like to give special thanks to Dr. Loida Martel for her dedicated service representing the Lexington Theological Seminary. We wish her well on her recent retirement and want to welcome Dr. John Barnes to our group. I sincerely look forward to working with you in the coming year. I also want to welcome Dr. Rebecca Gordon, who joined Transylvania's religion program this year, who will also begin her tenure on the committee this coming year. As always, thanks go to Elena Henderson, the Administrative Assistant for the Humanities. She does everything. She has been instrumental in coordinating all the moving parts and even the parts that don't move that such a lecture entails. Thank you, Chief Stephen Harold and DPS for covering security. Thank you to Mitch Fox and Bon Appetit for their hospitality. Thank you to Julie Martinez for the publicity and coordinating the live streaming for our off-campus constituents. Thank you to Dean Dr. Tiffany Wheeler and our President, Mr. Brian Lewis, for your ongoing support of the humanities and this lecture series. And lastly, thanks again to the Moosnick and Rosenthal families for envisioning this lecture series and then making it happen. At this time in history, it is especially important that we gather as a community in endeavors of empathetic learning. I am delighted to represent Transylvania University and play host to this prestigious lecture series, which is made possible by the kind commitment of many in terms of funding, location, time, and energy. A little history on the series. The Monroe Moosnick Lecture Series was established a number of years ago by a collaborative effort to provide an opportunity for interfaith dialogue. This endeavor has been enabled by the generous support of the Rosenthal and Moosnick families, as well as the Lexington Theological Seminary and the Jewish community of Central Kentucky. The series was specifically conceived as an interfaith effort to educate our Lexington community about Judaism and Jewish scholarship. Transylvania University is pleased to co-sponsor and host this annual event. The lecture is a two-part series with tonight's lecture here at Transylvania. Please join us tomorrow for the second in the series at Temple Adath Israel, where Rabbi David Wirtschafter has graciously opened their doors to us. It will take place at 7, and please do go to the website and register beforehand. In the past years, we have welcomed such speakers as Rabbi Dr. Myra Wasserman, Dr. Amanda Mbuvi, Dr. Melissa Clapper, and Rabbi David Fishman, just to name a few. This year's topic focuses on the function of history and memory in contemporary Jewish literature. I will, however, leave the introduction of our speaker to Sarah Jo Campbell, a Transylvania senior religion minor. Sarah Jo is a biochemistry major and religion minor who is an exemplary liberal arts student. She is an example of what all future doctors should aspire to, an excellent academic record in science, who is adept in reading and examining our social world, but most importantly, somebody who embodies empathy. It is fitting that she will introduce our speaker for the Moosnick lecture at a time when education is under threat and humanity has gone awry. The Moosnick Lecture Series and students like Sarah Jo give me hope for our collective futures, a future where we seek to engage in productive dialogue and rebuild a world that includes all. We need more Moosnicks, Rosenthals, and Sarah Jo's. I now turn things over to Sarah Jo to introduce our illustrious speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Barnsley. Good afternoon, everyone. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Claire Soufrian. Dr. Soufrian is the Director of Research and Publication at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, where she edits the award-winning Sources, a journal of Jewish ideas, oversees research seminars at the Institute's Kogod Research Center, and teaches adults, college students, and teens. Before joining Hartman in 2022, Dr. Soufrian served on the faculty at Northwestern University's Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies for over a decade. This evening, she'll share with us her lecture titled History and Memory of the Second Temple in Contemporary Jewish Literature. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Claire Soufrian.
Hi, everyone. I want to start just with my own set of thank yous. I'll go backwards to Sarah Jo for that lovely and generous introduction, to Carol Barnsley and the rest of the Moosnick committee, and of course to the Moosnick and Rosenthal families that support this lecture series, and Transy and Lexington Theological Seminary and the community, who are all the institutions that keep it going. And thank you to all of you for being here. So, I've never lectured before in a science classroom, I have to be honest. I'm a little overwhelmed by the size of the table, but I'll move around till I find the right spot. So don't mind me, that's just me getting comfortable. The central character, no, that's not right, sorry. The central character of Zusia on the Roof, a short story by American Jewish writer Nicole Krauss, first published in the New Yorker in 2013, is Brodman, a retired historian of the Jews. Recently recovered from a terrible illness, he is awaiting the birth of his first grandson and debating the cultural inheritance that is passed from generation to generation in his Jewish family. It's entirely an internal debate. He's not debating with anyone else, but just himself. He remembers his father wrapped in tefillin, phylacteries for prayer. He considers his two daughters, one of whom won't speak with him over differences in their politics around Israel. But at the center of Brodman's reflections is his questioning of his own decision to devote his life to the study of Jewish history. Consider this scene from his post-retirement life. You can read with your eyes, you can listen, I'm going to read it as well. When his old students came by, he sat under the primitive masks and held forth on the predicament of the Jewish historian. The Jews had finished writing history long ago, he said. When the rabbis closed the canon of the Bible, it was because they felt they had more than enough history. 2,000 years ago, the door was shut on sacred history, the only kind a Jew had any use for. Then came the zealotry and the messianism, the savagery of the Romans, the river of blood, the fire, the destruction, and finally, the exile. And I'll just say, since this is, you already know, a talking part about the Second Temple, that's the build-up to the destruction of the Second Temple in the first century of the Common Era, and then with exile, the aftermath. From then on, the Jews decided to live outside history. History was what happened to other people while the Jews were waiting for the Messiah to come. In the meantime, the rabbis busied themselves with Jewish memory only. And for 2 millennia, that memory had sustained an entire people. So who was he? Who were any of them to rock the boat? This passage, as you see, revolves around the idea of history. Enough history, sacred history. History is what happens to other people, not to Jews. In the context of the story, Brodman is questioning whether he spent his life well. Perhaps all of his work was unneeded, because the only thing Jews need to know about their collective past happened long, long ago, before the Bible ended. In burdening her character with this question, Krauss, the author, is introducing and engaging an idea first articulated by Yosef Yerushalmi, the historian on whom Brodmann is most likely based. In his book Zachor, first published in 1982, it actually was based on a lecture series, not unlike this one, Yerushalmi famously distinguishes between Jewish history on the one hand and Jewish memory on the other. Each is a different way of engaging with the past. According to Yerushalmi, history is the defining approach of Jews in the modern era. It relies on what we might call, although with respect to the science room that we're in, hard evidence. I'm glad you guys got that. Artifacts, first-hand reports, and the like. History assumes that the Jewish story, like any human story, is shaped by cause and effect. Human actors push it here and there, and its end remains unknown. If you ever took a Jewish history course or any kind of history course in a university setting or read a work of history, you're familiar with this approach. It's secular, measured, and ambivalent about questions of spiritual or theological meaning at best. Jewish memory, on the other hand, according to Yerushalmi, characterizes the way pre-modern Jews thought about the past. For Jewish memory describes a past shaped by God that is now relived through the annual calendar of Jewish holidays. Here, in this way of thinking about the past, evidence comes primarily from ancient texts, from the Hebrew Bible, and from rabbinic books like the Talmud or the Midrash, collections of commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. Jewish memory is a source of meaning for Jewish life, providing consolation in hard times, assuring Jews in hard times and in easier times that their covenant with God, first articulated in the Bible, remains in place, no matter how random events of the day may seem. Memory assures Jews that there is a plan to it all, and that there is an end. No one knows when it will be, but history, memory, tells us that the story, the human story, will end with messianic redemption. Krauss's character Brodmann, as we saw, described Jewish memory as sacred history, and described the rabbis as closing the door on history even before the destruction of the Second Temple, making ordinary history essentially irrelevant to their project of Judaism. Consider how Yerushalmi describes the rabbis' attitude toward the past. And by the rabbis here, I'm referring to the rabbis, really the first rabbis who lived in the first few centuries of the Common Era and really transformed what had been the religion of the temple based in sacrifice into the foundation for Judaism as we know it today, which is based in prayer and study instead of sacrifice and prophecy. So this is from Yerushalmi. For the rabbis, the Bible was not only a repository of past history, but a revealed pattern of the whole of history, and they had learned their scriptures well. They knew that history has a purpose, the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, and that the Jewish people has a central role to play in the process. They were convinced that the covenant between God and the people Israel was eternal, though the Jews had often rebelled and suffered the consequences. Above all, they had learned, and therefore they taught, they had learned from the Bible and taught that the true pulse of history often beat beneath its manifest surfaces an invisible history that was more real than what the world, derived by the more strident outward rhythms of power, could recognize. Yerushalmi believed that enlightenment and civic emancipation, the twin forces that had thrust the Jews of Western Europe and eventually nearly all Jews into modernity, he believed these forces had ruptured Jewish access to Jewish memory. He describes modern Jewish history writing as, quote, divorced from the Jewish collective memory and in crucial respects thoroughly at odds with it. And he insists that modern Jews can have all the history they want, even as they remain alienated from memory. Other historians have questioned Yerushalmi's account, pointing, for example, to medieval Jewish chronicles as evidence that the history-memory divide doesn't map so neatly onto modern and pre-modern. I'm not going to go into those because what interests me most among the critiques is one that's a little bit different and was stated most explicitly, I think, or potentially the best, in my favorite language, by a colleague of mine at the Shalom Hartman Institute, Yehuda Kurtzer. In his 2012 work, Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past, Kurtzer pushes back against Yerushalmi's view that the modern Jew must be content with history and cannot find meaning in the past in the same way that pre-modern Jews did. He argues further that American Jews, his primary audience and his primary concern, are in fact hungry for meaning, and they will find it in renewing their sense of Jewish memory. They must let go. It's worth noting he himself was trained as a historian, and nevertheless, his message is that contemporary Jews must let go of the empiricist's desire to know every detail of a long-ago past, and they must turn instead to what he calls a selective reclamation of the past and a translation of that past into purposefulness. Not surprisingly, Kurtzer spends most of his book, unlike Yerushalmi, considering how it is that modern Jews do interact with memory and how it is that they can bring more memory into their lives, or more of an orientation of memory. For him, memory is linked to ritual. Ritual is the key that breaks memory open and makes it available. And he points to the classic example of the reenactment of the Exodus, the biblical Exodus from Egypt, every year in the Passover Seder. Memory allows for creative interpretations that far exceed the limits of history's insistence on empirical data and rational argument. Go to a Seder at a Jewish family's home and you might see children putting on a play and costumes. My own family's table is covered in my parents' collection of small frogs, right? Plastic frogs, glass frogs, we use them once a year on the table. Why? Because key to the story are the 10 plagues, and one of those plagues was frogs. Kurtzer drives his creativity point home through a comparison of the Passover Seder with common practices Jewish communities use to mark Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. He writes, on Passover, we insert ourselves into a narrative. We become the oppressed and the liberated. On Yom HaShoah, the custom has emerged that we become passive listeners to a survivor, to an eyewitness. On Passover, we toy with a template and make it relevant. On Yom HaShoah, our memory is dictated by listening to the precise recitation of specific events. We remember the Exodus by privileging the centrality of its message of liberation in our own time. But the commanding memory of the Holocaust in our present climate, in and out of Yom HaShoah, is precisely the opposite. Think again of his description, and some of you may have been at events like this, his description of sitting in a room like this, listening to a Holocaust survivor relay their experiences as a way of commemorating the Holocaust on this Remembrance Day. That's an approach of history, right? Tell me what happened. What are the details? And I'll share with you, when I was in college, the university where I was at happened to house an archive of videos of survivor testimony. So survivors would come in and they were recorded telling their stories, and now there's this incredible collection of videos. I had a friend who worked, that was her work study job. She worked in that office. And I learned from her something that has stayed with me ever since, which is before survivors would record their stories, they would come in beforehand and they would practice. They would tell the whole story without being videotaped. And then part of my friend's job was to go and check all the facts of the story. Were the dates correct? Right? If somebody said that their town was liquidated by the Nazis on Wednesday, November 5th, 19 whatever, someone had to go to the calendar and make sure it was really a Wednesday, not a Tuesday. And someone could check against the meticulous records that we have. Was that the correct date? And the worry, of course, was that if any small detail was wrong in the recorded version, it could be used as evidence by Holocaust deniers. So it's very serious work, and I don't mean to diminish its importance, but it does encapsulate the approach of history. Let's get it exactly right. Let's verify with multiple sources. Let's listen to the eyewitness, the person who survived, and we maintain kind of a different distance in a way that memory doesn't allow for. Memory invites closeness. Now I have to find where I was. Kurtzer seeks a model, so after he gives this analysis of the difference, he seeks a model for responding to the Holocaust, an alternative or a memory-oriented response in rabbinic writing about the destruction of the Second Temple, particularly writings about ritual responses, ways that people commemorated that destruction in the centuries afterward. He chooses one text from the Tosefta. It's a collection of relatively early rabbinic material that didn't make it into the main collections, but got preserved kind of as extra stuff. It's still important. And in this text, we learn about a group of Jews who have eliminated meat and wine from their diet. They don't eat meat, they don't drink wine. And meat and wine, for the rabbis, are both symbols of joy. Right? You eat meat and you eat wine at happy occasions, on holidays, and so forth. And they have eliminated them entirely. Rabbi Joshua rebukes these ascetics, explaining to them that not to mourn at all is impossible, for the decree has been declared. But to mourn excessively is also impossible. And he offers them two alternative practices. Don't eliminate joy entirely. Eat your meat, drink your wine, but leave a small part of your home, a small part of the wall, unpainted, so that it's always a little bit incomplete. Remove one piece of jewelry from your outfit before you go out. This is a way of turning to ritual, to practice, to manage grief in order to make it possible to live. Rabbi Joshua shows how to incorporate grief into ordinary life, including the joy and hope that are implicit in building a new home or in adorning one's body. Insisting upon small imperfections within these joyful practices domesticates the destruction of the temple. It gives each person access to the experience of destruction, while also allowing for a post-destruction present and future with happiness in them. So I agree with Kurtzer that ritual is key, but ritual is not enough. I want to suggest that storytelling, and therefore literature, is just as essential. The stories that Jews tell, the way they tell them, these are a way of generating meaning from the past, a way of wrestling with that past, a way of keeping that past real, keeping it as memory. What I'd like to do today, with the time we have left, is I'm going to look at how the Jerusalem Temple, the Second Jerusalem Temple, appears in two recent novels by Jewish American novelists, writers. We're going to go back to Nicole Krauss first and look at her book, Great House, and then we'll look at Dara Horn's book, Eternal Life. And I'm going to try to pull out, I'm going to show you how I read them, and try to pull out an argument that I think each writer is making or suggesting about contemporary Jewish engagement with the Jewish past. So we'll start with Great House. Great House is Nicole Krauss's third novel. It was published in 2010. The book is structured into two halves. I'm going to give you just enough information to understand my argument. I'm not going to spoil the text. This one I'm going to spoil a little bit, but you should still read it. But I've tried to really keep it focused. So the book is structured in two halves, and each of those halves is further divided into a number of stories, each one narrated by a different character. What all of the stories, all of those chapters share is in each one there's a desk, the same desk. It is a heavy, overbearing piece of furniture. It has 17 drawers. It has a magical spell over anyone who sits at it, helping writers to write, and when it leaves their possession, leaving them bereft and with the worst case of writer's block anyone has ever experienced. So the furniture, this desk, moves through the stories until ultimately it ends up in a storage room in New York. We learn along the way that before the Holocaust, the desk belonged to a Hungarian Jewish family named Weiss, mother, father, and son. After his parents were murdered and their home was lost in the war, the younger Weiss, the son, settles in Israel, marries, and becomes an antiques dealer with a specialty of helping Holocaust survivors recover possessions stolen by the Nazis during the war. He's successful, he makes a good living, but his true passion lies in redeeming his parents' possessions. He helps other people find theirs in order to finance his own search for his own parents' possessions. In particular, he is recreating his father's study in one room of his own home. And by the time the novel opens, he has everything. He has the books, he has the lamps, everything but the desk. In a sense, we could say that as the desk moves from chapter to chapter, it's like we are Weiss, putting together the story of where it is. I'm going to focus in on one of those stories, which is narrated by Isabel. Isabel is a dear friend of Weiss's children, who are named Leah and Yoav, and she tells us that Weiss's pursuit of his father's study has crippled his children. She describes them as prisoners of their fathers, locked within the walls of their own family. In the end, it wasn't possible for them to belong to anyone else. Leah is sent by her father once he figures out where the desk is. He sends her to New York to get it, and she is the one who puts it in storage and refuses to give it to him. But Weiss then dies by suicide. That's the spoiler. In the study that he has so painstakingly recreated, not long after Leah had hid the desk from him, Leah and Yoav, his children, blame themselves for this act of violence, and they retreat. They move back from London to Tel Aviv, retreat into their home. They destroy basically the lives they had built for themselves separate from him. Isabel quotes from a letter that Leah writes to her 6 years after the death of Weiss. I thought I'd killed him with what I'd done, but it was just the opposite. When I read his suicide letter, I understood that my father had won. At last, he'd found a way to make it impossible for us to escape him. After he died, we went home to the house in Jerusalem, and we stopped living. It can't go on like this, or we really will stop living. She ends the letter by pleading with Isabel to come to Israel and to rescue Yoav from their self-imposed imprisonment. And Isabel does. We know already at this point in the book that Isabel and Yoav are married, and they have a child, David. In the book's closing chapter, we finally hear from Weiss. He speaks in his own voice, and his words lead us to question Leah's interpretation of his suicide. We learn that before his death, Weiss was in New York. He found the desk where Leah had hidden it. He bribed a guard to let him into the storage space. He sat at the desk. He chose not to take it. In the moments before he finally saw the desk for the last time, Weiss tells us he came to an understanding that he shouldn't complete his father's study. He comes to understand, he tells us, that Yoav will have a child, and this child is the one who should inherit the desk. One day a child will be born, a child whose provenance is the union of a woman and a riddle. One night, as the infant sleeps in the bedroom, his mother will sense a presence outside the window. At first, she will think it is just her own reflection, haggard in her milk-stained robe. But a moment later, she will sense it again, and suddenly afraid, she will switch off the lights and hurry to the baby's room. The glass door of the bedroom will be open. On top of the pile of the child's tiny white clothes, his mother will find an envelope with his name, written in small, neat handwriting. Inside the envelope will be a key and the address of a storage room in New York City. And outside in the dark garden, the wet grass will slowly straighten up again, erasing my daughter's footsteps. I think my favorite paragraph in the whole book. So I want to suggest that Weiss represents in this story an attempt to recreate the past in precise terms. He represents history. And his decision to give up on his project is Krauss's way of telling us that history, or perhaps history alone, but history is a trap. It can become a trap. You can get caught in it. Think about Weiss's relationships with his children that are so damaged. When he decides not to take the desk, to give up on his historical recreation, he frees himself just enough that he can imagine a future, imagine a grandchild. The fact that Isabel and Yoav named their son David invokes the rabbinic hope of a messianic redeemer, right? The Messiah, according to the Bible, will be a descendant of King David. And the fact that this child who will inherit the desk has the name David adds an additional element of hope to the possibility of a new relationship in that generation with the desk, with the past. Another aspect of Krauss's vision for Jewish remembrance is transmitted in an earlier episode. This is again Weiss, but he's talking at this point with Arthur, a different character, professor at Oxford. Arthur's wife had once owned the desk. She's no longer living. But in the course of their conversation, Weiss tells this story to Arthur. What he's describing here, he's retelling a story that his own father used to tell about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who famously, at least in the Talmud, famously established a rabbinic study house in the city of Yavne after the destruction of the temple. In Weiss's retelling, when scholars gathered to argue about the law, quote begins, they became so absorbed in their work that sometimes they forgot the question their teacher had asked. What is a Jew without Jerusalem? Only later, after Ben Zakkai died, did his answer slowly reveal itself, the way an enormous mural only begins to make sense as you walk backwards away. Turn Jerusalem into an idea, turn the temple into a book as vast and holy as the city itself. Bend a people around the shape of what they lost. With the birth and development of rabbinic culture, the Talmud, and that the Talmud, I'm putting it in here as a symbol for all of rabbinic culture, but it is the most important work. It's titled in Hebrew with a word that means to study. The Talmud becomes the new great house, the new temple. Weiss further remembers his father teaching him that now every Jewish soul is built around the house that burned in that fire, so vast that we can, each one of us, only recall the tiniest fragment, a pattern on the wall, a knot in the wood of a door, a memory of how light fell across the floor. And again, that echo, it's not a recreating of the temple, it's forming a people, forming a book and then a people around the gap that is left. Perhaps Weiss says that is what they mean when they speak of the Messiah, a perfect assemblage of the infinite parts of Jewish memory. In the next world, we will all dwell together in the memory of our memories. It's tempting to understand the role of the desk within the novel as a symbol of the past, particularly given how immensely physically overpowering it is. But no one who possesses the desk really knows anything about it. People know who they got it from and who they gave it from. They know about their own experience of it, but nobody other than Weiss knows where it started. And that too is an aspect of memory. It's inherently incomplete and alive momentarily. And still, just as the the desk is so powerful in the lives of these individuals, a relationship to the past of memory is similarly powerful. So I'm going to turn now to the work of a different novelist and a different book, a very different style of book. The novelist is Dara Horn. So in recent years, Horn has been most well known not for a work of fiction, but for a nonfiction book she published during the pandemic in 2021. Some of you may have read it or heard her talking about it on the radio or read a review of it. It made a big splash, in part because of the title, People Love Dead Jews. The overarching claim she's making is that non-Jews, or that she makes in this book, is that non-Jews are most comfortable talking about Jewish life as a historical rather than a present-day reality. She makes her case most successfully in a series of travelogues examining Jewish museums in places where Jews once lived and no longer do. I have quibbles with the argument. I'm not going to get into them. I want to focus on one chapter that's a little different from the rest of the book. And it's a chapter about how Jews themselves remember their ancestors. Or, if you'll allow me to echo her book title, How Living Jews Engage with Dead Jews. As Horn recounts, many American Jewish families, especially of Ashkenazi or Western European background, many American Jewish families tell a story along the lines of, our ancestors arrived in the United States with an unwieldy Eastern European last name. It was too hard for the immigration officer to say it, let alone spell it for the records. And so that officer shortened it to something more manageable and eased our family's way into American society. Now, it's true that many American Jews whose ancestors came to this country during the major wave of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century are called by shortened versions of their ancestors' names. But in many, if not most cases, these names were not actually gently and helpfully changed at Ellis Island or another port of entry. We have countless records, court records, of immigrant Jews coming before American judges in the early 20th century asking to change their legal names. They had to petition and get permission. Why? As they explain in these records, they were motivated by a desire to escape the notice of anti-Semites. They were changing their names because of anti-Semitism. Most American Jews don't like to hear this. We're all attached to our family stories and myths. Horn has a take on this that echoes Kurtzer in a surprising way. I'm not going to read this whole thing, it's very long. But she says, you can tell your children that something funny happened at Ellis Island, something completely innocent that didn't hurt you, but only helped you. If you tell that story, you've accomplished two things. First, you've made America into a place where people maintain their Jewish identity without any interruption. And second, you've made America into a place so welcoming that happy non-Jews greet you at the door and then make innocent mistakes that coincidentally help you to fit right in, at no cost to you or to the 3,000-year-old tradition you want to maintain. I'm going to skip a little bit. So this is 2021 is when the book comes out. The lethal attacks on American Jews in recent years have been so shocking and disorienting, not merely because of their sheer violent horror, but because they contradict the story American Jews have told themselves for generations, which is that America has never been a place where anti-Semitism affected anyone's life. We don't simply prefer, this is where she surprised me, we don't simply prefer this founding legend. We need it. The story is more important than the history because the story is the device that makes meaning. In other words, this is why Horn, to me at least, takes a surprising turn. Because you think at first that she's a champion of history. Right? Don't lie to yourself. Acknowledge that your ancestors, when they came here, it was hard. And they felt targeted. And they struggled. And one of the ways they made it through that struggle was by changing their names to be a little bit less conspicuously Jewish. You think that's where she's going. But instead, she's saying, no, we actually need to tell the story about an America that is welcoming Because that's the America we want. And if we tell the story about the America that we want, maybe that will be the America we have in the present. Maybe we can live in a way that is comfortable. In most of Horn's nonfiction, the essays in People Love Dead Jews and work that she's published since then, and especially since October 7th, 2023, she's pretty pessimistic about Jewish life in America and Jewish life more broadly. That's why this passage is so striking. The story is the device that makes meaning. Story is memory, of course. Memory, she is saying, is what we need to move forward. I find Horn teasing this idea out, not in anywhere else in the book of nonfiction essays, but actually in her fiction, especially in her last novel, Eternal Life, which came out a few years before People Love Dead Jews in 2018. The premise of Eternal Life is simple. The setting is the waning days of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. A Jewish woman, Rachel, the daughter of a scribe, has a love affair with a young rebel priest named Eleazar. When she becomes pregnant, she marries her father's apprentice, Zakkai, who is a gentle man, doesn't ask a lot of questions, and she gives birth to her son without anyone learning his true parentage. When that son, named Yochanan, becomes deathly ill, Rachel and her lover do what they can. They offer sacrifices at the temple, they take vows. These are ways that people beg God to intervene and to show them favor in temple times. But none of it works. Ultimately, the high priest offers them a vow so extreme that it seems it's never been offered before. If they each give up their mortality, if they agree to live forever, their son will recover and live. The desperate parents agree, and the story unfolds from there. Eternal Life, in other words, is a story about a Jewish woman who cannot die. Her many lives are therefore interwoven, first with rabbinic legends, and then with the rest of Jewish history. She lives through it all. You may have already put pieces together and realized that her son Yochanan is, of course, Yochanan ben Zakkai, Yochanan the son of Zakkai. Zakkai is the scribe's apprentice. He's not his biological father, but he has his name. That's the family he comes from. In rabbinic lore, Yochanan ben Zakkai is a man who fakes his own death. Right? We already know he ends up at Yavne, he has students, and he teaches them. How does he get from Jerusalem to Yavne, according to rabbinic lore? He fakes his own death. His students sneak him out of the besieged Jerusalem in the days before the destruction of the Second Temple, because coffins are allowed to leave while living people are not. And he escapes, goes to Yavne, as we know, where he leads the way in preserving Jewish practices and ideas and ultimately helping to create rabbinic Judaism. There's a moment in the novel when it seems that he is first coming up with the idea of replacing temple Judaism with something else. He's like a teenager in this story. He's talking with Rachel as she cleans their oven. That's the first thing they do in the temple each morning, clean out the ashes from the sacrifices of the day before, Yochanan continued. Every single thing they do is an act of total devotion. If that's true, then every parent who ever lived is a priest, Rachel thought, but did not say. Then Yochanan said something she would remember for many years. Maybe we wouldn't need a temple, he said, if more people knew how to be priests. And of course, without a temple, you don't need priests. Priests manage the temple, they take care of sacrifices. The work they do can only happen there, essentially. He is redefining what it means to be a priest, right? To live with total devotion. Notice, however, that Rachel's thoughts go beyond Yochanan's. Every parent is already a priest. She finds priestly devotion where it already exists outside the temple, but she stays silent. After Ben Zakkai escapes, Rachel survives the siege and then the destruction of the temple. She later sits with Yochanan when he is on his deathbed and she survives his death too. She grows old, seems to die, and is immediately reborn a young Jewish woman in a slightly different setting. She marries, bears children, seems to die. It repeats over and over. In the book of Genesis, in the Bible, the matriarch Rachel dies in childbirth. But the rabbis retell her story and extend it. They envision her as a symbol for the sadness of the destruction of the temple and of exile. They picture her weeping for her exiled children eternally. Horne's Rachel lives rather than dies for her child, but she spends her life weeping for the children she has outlived. Both Rachel's, biblical and in Horne's book, are embodiments of mourning. They are memories of Jewish longing. But Horne's Rachel resists stories and storytelling. She questions the stories she was told as a child. She hesitates to speak or to tell her own story. We saw she did not share her thoughts with Yochanan. But ultimately, because the conditions of her life are so strange, she cannot explain herself, or even really, she cannot explain herself, or even try to explain herself to anyone at all. Because she lives forever, essentially, she is alive for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and for the war in 1967, where Israeli troops move into the old city of Jerusalem for the first time. And that eventually allows Rachel and her family, and many, many, many others, of course, to visit the site of the destroyed temple. When Rachel had taken her family for the first time to Jerusalem in 1968, she hadn't known how she would feel. She had seen the western wall, this is the one remaining part of the temple, and she had crumpled into historical, gagging, wrenching sobs. To be so close and to still be trapped. Her husband and children were embarrassed. They made up stories for the tour guide about how she had been religious as a child, while the tour guide cracked English jokes about the Wailing Wall. It's another name for the Western Wall. Later, her family asked her what was wrong. She did not tell them. I want to suggest that the tension in Horne's novel is not immediately between history and memory, as much as it is between living a story and telling the story. Rachel's impossible situation shows us how important it is, or I think Horne is trying to tell us how important it is to be able to tell your story and to be understood. As a Jew who won't die, we might say that Rachel is a symbol of the Jewish people, the people who persist despite the odds over and over. I think that what Horne is up to is saying it's not enough even for the Jews to live. Jews need to keep their memories alive, need to be telling their stories. Could she have made this point in a novel against a different background? Why against the temple story? Or why against the destruction of the temple? So I want to offer two reasons, and then I'll be done. I saw that the temple served Krauss as a metaphor for the Holocaust. And it's also worth noting, in the same vein, that post-Holocaust theologians have relied, just like Kurtzer did, on rabbinic responses to the destruction of the temple for a vocabulary for talking about belief in God after the Holocaust. So perhaps Horne, too, is using the temple and the destruction of the temple to talk about the Holocaust, to talk about how hard it is for survivors of the Holocaust to be heard. But maybe there's a second reason, a little lighter. This reason is a little lighter, and that is simply that the stories that the rabbis tell about themselves are amazing stories. Yochanan ben Zakkai escaping in a coffin as though he is dead. What a great story. For a novelist like Horne, I suspect that that would be hard to resist. And so I think a final piece of what is going on in this particular book and in other books that incorporate, as Krauss did, the temple in one way or another. We have examples of memory being kept alive, memory surviving by being retold in a new setting, a new vocabulary, to a new audience. Thank you.
Thank you, that was lovely.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, so please raise your hands and I'll call on you. Please.
Have you ever read Leon Trotsky's work, The Jewish Problem?
Probably a long, long time ago.
We still face the same issues back then. And it's written by a bad Jew like me. You know, he's only a Jew when he wants to be. But he wrote that, and when he was forming the new Soviet government, and he wanted everyone to be a communist, and he said about Jews, he said they only care about themselves, therefore they're racist. But he did say that every child, there's no such thing as an illegitimate child, because he wanted everyone to join the party. And there was a lot of good things in that work, but I think we should all read it, and it's very recent. And it set the stage before the Holocaust. And my father was there. And when people say there's no Holocaust, they do disservice to the English and French soldiers that helped us be alive today.
Thank you.
What role do you think emotions play in memory?
So I think memory evokes emotions, and that is that's a big part of what they do, what it means for them to be alive or to be kept alive. I think about, as you saw, even just in the short passages that I shared, that emotion, crying especially, comes up in many of them. Fear, and I think it's an essential piece of memory.
Emily.
So one of the things that I'm really struck by is the difference between Yom HaShoah and Passover.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because in the case of Passover, right, we talk about this happened to all of us, right? And I have this kind of weird, kind of guilty feeling in myself, right, where my family was here, right? My family immigrated during pogroms, and so my grandfather served in World War II, building Camp David. He didn't even serve overseas, right? He was here. So for me, Yom HaShoah is witnessing something that happened to my community that I belong in, and happened to distant cousins and the family that was left, for sure, but not everybody in my family. And I think there is that difference, and I'm curious how you kind of reconcile, kind of how do we as a community, for those of us who can't trace our lineage directly to survivors, right?
Yeah.
But also are, and I did have cousins who survived Auschwitz, like all of us probably did. Like, how do we kind of reconcile these things? And even thinking about that diasporically, right, to the communities that weren't directly impacted in that way too.
It's a great question, and I have a few thoughts. I'll make sure they're organized in my mind. I think part of the challenge is that the Holocaust is still so recent.
Mm-hmm.
We still have survivors. I was able, on my father's side, I'm the descendant of survivors. I was able to go with a cousin and my father and some other relatives to the town that my grandparents were from. It's so close. And there's a sense, even when I say that, right, that Eastern European experience belongs to me because it's close to me in a way that you might not feel it belongs to you. In contrast to biblical stories, which are memory, they can't even be history. If you turn on this is not how we interact with TV anymore, but if you were to turn on the Discovery Channel, right, you can watch, very late at night, you can watch a show where they try to describe how the Red Sea split in scientific terms. That's history. There's a reason it's on in the middle of the night. It's really just not that interesting. Like, the story, the memory approach of the Red Sea splitting and the slaves marching through that opening toward freedom, that's an extraordinary story. And the Holocaust is still too close to be memory, and therefore I think it's too close to be shared that widely. Yehuda Kurtzer does not have a ritual to suggest. I will tell you, this is the final piece of my answer. So I guess what I'm saying in a way is eventually, I think it will belong to all people, and people won't be able to say this was my family or not my family. It's true also even with the Exodus, and I think it's worth remembering, there are people who've converted and joined the Jewish people. And if we speak biologically, their ancestry is not going back to the Exodus, but the story belongs to them as much as it belongs to any other Jew. And I assume that that will happen with time. We won't see it, but it will happen. So I want to just share, I'm aware of 2 attempts to create rituals to use on Yom HaShoah. And one of them follows the model of the Passover Seder. It was put together by Rabbi Avi Weiss, who's in New York. And it doesn't work. It's in some ways it's too literal. At one point, the parents in the room are separated from the children, just as parents were separated from children. The food that's served is potato peels boiled in water, because that was the soup that was served in the death camps. I don't need to share more, you get a sense. The other example that I know was written first in Israel, and then there's like an Americanized, not just translated, but Americanized version that combines words written by survivors, like little short passages where they recount their experiences that are read by participants, with passages written by people today talking about distance and recognition and sort of about how we are relating to the past. So it's still probably a little too self-conscious, but it's a little better than a reenactment. So I hope that's helpful.
If I could continue this discussion, though, when you say that we're too close to the event for it to be everybody's story, and yet at the same time, it is being used not only as a story for Jews, but a story for everybody. I'm
Right.
sitting between my 2 colleagues who have founded the project to help Kentucky school teachers fulfill the legal mandate that something about the Holocaust must be taught in our public schools. And of course, we don't have a public mandate to teach the story of the Exodus in the public schools.
For sure.
So it seems to me something that we have to think about is going on with this.
So as you probably know from your colleagues, the question of what is Holocaust education for has been sort of blown open in a new way in the last 2 years, in part because with the rise or the return of anti-Semitism in this country, especially violent anti-Semitism, some Holocaust educators are saying we must have failed. But whoever said that the purpose of Holocaust education is to prevent anti-Semitism would be the next step in the argument. Well then, what is it? I think the distinction that I'm making is there's a way of relating to the Holocaust, which is what happens in a lot of Holocaust education that's for a general audience or for a Jewish audience, in which it's an event in history. It happened in that place to those people. It was perpetrated by these people. And then there's my family's story. And I think the comment a moment ago was pointing to, in Jewish communities today, there are some who can say it's my story, and some who can say, and everyone else can say it's a Jewish story, but it's not my story. Is that helpful in terms of clarifying? I think that's what that question was getting at. I don't mean to suggest that I'm opposed to Holocaust education, or I don't think there's something that everyone can learn. I'm not sure what everyone should learn from studying the Holocaust. It's open to me, but that's the difference.
Of course, one issue is a lot of students might say, well, it's not my family story, why isn't my family story? But
time for one more question.
So in that way, is the practice that some organizations are doing of expanding one story so that children can hear a story and have a memory of that story and start to ingest or develop or memorize that story as something that they remember and can tell again, part of this continuing or evolving memory, in that it's something they can relate to and visualize and see.
So I'm going to be very honest and say we're wading into territory where my opinions are not fully formed, but these are things I'm thinking about. And one of the things I'm thinking about a lot lately is, and maybe this also speaks to your last question, is the difference between learning history as something that happened to those people, or even as the story of my family, and learning it as it could have been me. And I think what you're describing can veer into the territory of it could have been me, or it's the luckiest thing that it wasn't me. It could have been me, and I'm not sure that's the right move. I'm not sure it's the right move.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.